In some strange way, anthropology has contributed to the focus on mythology and myth, generally speaking, because, of course, this is part of the study of people, but also more specifically because anthropology has been telling the story of people. And as a result of that, it has been pretty easy for people who did something that was called anthropology to essentially create the mythology of people as they were living, as opposed to the more typical myth that respond to a distant past. This became kind of the practice of those who are telling the story of others to essentially remove some of the embarrassing details and add some little fancy new inventions or misinterpretations and turn that into a mythology. And to counteract that, the process that is explained in the article reading for this week is that anthropologists should be working more to understand the life story of people. That is to try to fill in the least detail possible and rather focus on telling the story of the people as they exist. The funnest part about this article is probably the use of two anthropologists with funny names, Klakon and Kakshut, several more funny names around that, and feel free to read the rest of the article on your own time. Um, Clyde Klakon, who is quoted in this particular part here, argued that until 1945, most life histories could be labeled only as interesting curiosities. So, of course, if you are telling people stories based on the outliers, the details, the curiosities, as Clarkon points out, you are going to turn the stories into interesting tidbits, but not necessarily be very representative of the people. So he said there is a sizable bulk of biographical material available, but its significance from either the cultural or the personological angles has not been expounded. Analysis has been almost entirely limited to drawing attention to very specific, sometimes trivial ethnographic points. Annotation has been highly but scarcely systematically selective. Psychological analysis by an anthropologist of a life history from a non-literate group remains to be tried. So a good part of the thing that Kalakon is criticizing is this focus on the aspects of the weird, on the details, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that anthropologists were studying indigenous people around the world, and they appeared strange. And this is only part of the mission of anthropology. Of course, identifying people as strange is quite easy, but making sense out of it is a lot more of a difficult task and supposedly part of the science of anthropology itself. However, the lack of analysis, the emphasis on the trivial points is really becoming a problematic by the middle of the 20th century. So as a result of that, there is the kind of a renewed emphasis on on the aspects that are more meaningful and perhaps sometimes a little bit more abstract, because it is very difficult to highlight exactly what is significant to a different group. It is probably a lot easier to make sense out of the aesthetic sense behind it. And so the article, again from the same article reading for this week, the aesthetics of life description calls upon our powers of insight and empathy. Such an endeavor means that the writer must come to know and understand the other individual. The created image of the other's life is expressed in the expression of it, and the true aesthetics of this image is found in the writer's ability to see clearly what others may only sense or feel, but not may see themselves. And well, none of this is particularly surprising if you have taken an anthropology class before, but it does go down to perspective and creating a sense of perspective that people may not have for themselves, while at the same time having the sense of perspective that is necessary for your own culture. So understanding what your biases are and making sense out of what other people's biases may be at the same time. Myth in this context is really interesting to study from the point of view of perspective because, kind of by design, the myth is weird. The myth is kind of unsettling, as we have pointed out before. It is a thing that kind of puts us outside of our typical situation and therefore kind of highlights some parts of our lives that may or may not be immediately visible because life is boring for the most part. Our lives are boring except for the highlights, the high moments and the low moments, of course, both of them being important. But the vast majority of it is really a bunch of seemingly not very meaningful parts, and lots of the most important part of our lives are actually to be found in those seemingly not important parts. They are actually the constitutive elements. They are the basis for everything else to happen. So, looking at the way in which our lives are played out in the myth is already looking at those pre-analyzed moments of life, and especially for Joseph Campbell, whom we have mentioned a few times, the myth to him is an portrayal of life as a whole, and he was doing what little advocates here with in the first slide anyway, the life history of a non-literate group, the psychological profile of a life history of a non-literate group, the the larger possibility of looking at myth, which is the oral tradition, that is a non-literate tradition, non-literate history, looking at it from a vaguely psychological point of view. Now, Freud, that we have mentioned before, Freud was very much inspired by early anthropologists as well, and a lot of his point of view has to do with these early anthropological decisions. But of course, he eventually took his own way through it. Now, Sigmund Freud stresses in his writings the passages and difficulties of the first half of the human cycle of life, those of our infancy and adolescence, when our sun is mounting towards its zenith. C.J. Young, Carl Jung, on the other hand, has emphasized the crises of the second portion, when, in order to advance, the shining sphere must submit to descend and disappear at last into the night womb of the grave. The normal symbols of our desires and fears become converted in our afternoon of the biography into their opposites, for it is then no longer life but death that is the challenge. What is difficult to leave then is not the womb but the phallus, unless indeed the life weariness has already seized the heart, when it will be the death that calls with the promise of bliss that formerly was the lure of love. Full circle, from the tomb to the womb, from the womb to the tomb, we come, an ambiguous, enigmatical incursion into the world of solid matter that is soon to melt from us like the substance of a dream. Very poetic, very typical of Campbell, who was again very much interested in myth writ large, and studied comparatively a bunch of myths, pointing out that if essentially in the context of our psychology, making sense of those important foundational moments of our early lives is obviously a very different task than making sense of the later parts of our lives. Now, we have mentioned some of that before in the context of spirits, of course. In the context of spirit, the spirits themselves that are inhabiting the space between life and death are also kind of showing us the way into what that means to be alive, and perhaps what it means to be barreling towards a death. But Campbell was mostly known for his analysis of the heroes, or what we have called before the hero with a thousand faces. That's the title of the book. And he focuses on the rites of passage. This also we have seen before in the context of folklore. The rites of passage, which occupy such prominent place in the life of a primitive society, ceremonials of birth, naming, puberty, marriage, burial, etc., are distinguished by formal, usually very severe exercises of severance, whereby the mind is radically cut away from the attitudes, attachments, and life patterns of the stage left behind, being left behind. Then follows an interval of more or less extended retirement, during which are enacted rituals designed to introduce the life adventurer to the forms and proper feelings of his new estate, so that when at last the time has ripened for the return to the normal world, the initiate will be as good as reborn. The rites of passage, as we have pointed out, are these kind of highlights, and Campbell lists a few here: birth, naming, puberty, marriage, burial, etc. Things that we are turning into essentially festivals, albeit family festivals, to highlight their importance in our lives and kind of serve as milestones when we look back to the times when those things happen, and we can more easily make sense of the path we have traveled since then and the things that have changed in our lives. And Campbell notes that this is, in fact, how myths work. They emphasize, first and foremost, those kind of transformational moments. And as a result, Campbell figured out that the myth and any kind of mythical story in this context has a very similar structure that is very cyclical, where at the beginning of the path, the mythological adventure of the hero is focusing on this formula, again pointed out here, of rites of passage, starting with the top and going through various stages, more or less high, more or less low, and being changed as the hero goes. And again, in part of the heroes that we talked about last week, for example, Cincinnatus, who is living a boring life in the field, kind of minding his own business, but he is called to adventure by the war, by the necessities of his country. So gives up um, he gives up his everyday task and goes on this quest, on this adventure, on this task to save his people, and then eventually he goes back to where he started. So he's going through these stages. Put into words here, the stages as this way. The following pages will present in the form of one composite adventure the tales of a number of the world's symbolic carriers of the destiny of every man. The first great stage, that the separation of departure, will be shown in part 1, chapter 1, 5 subsections. First, the call to adventure, or the sign on the vocation of the hero. 2, refusal of the call, or the folly of the flight from the god. So somebody being called to a crazy mission, and first they don't want to take it, but they received, number 3, supernatural aid, the unsuspected assistance that comes to one who has undertaken his proper adventure. 4, the crossing of the first threshold, and 5, the belly of the whale, or the passage into the realm of the night. So there's a threshold that is passed where the hero has to give up the world before and go full bore into the adventure, which enters the second stage. The stage of the trial and victories of initiation will appear in chapter 2, 6 subsections. Number 1, the road of trials, on the dangerous aspects of the gods, the meeting with the goddess, Magna Mater, so the great mother, or the bliss of infancy regained. 3, woman as the temptress, the realization and agony of Oedipus. 4, atonement with the father. 5, apotheosis, kind of the victory. And 6, the ultimate boon, the goal. So the hero will encounter some issues along the way, but eventually will discover something about themselves that solves all the issues and gives them the key to complete their fight. And eventually goes to the return, number 1, with the refusal of the return, or the world denied, because the world has changed and they have changed, and it seemed like going back to the world before is a very difficult task. The magic flight, or the escape of Prometheus, the rescue from without, the crossing of the return threshold, or the return to the world of common day. And finally, the person comes back as the master of the two worlds, the person who has experienced the most difficult part of their lives, but also becomes changed as a result of that. And 6, freedom to live, the nature and function of the ultimate boon. The person, the hero, has completing their task and come back a better person, and hopefully the world is better as a result. Final note, this circular adventure of the hero appears in a negative form in stories of the deluge type, where it is not the hero who goes to the power, but the power that rises against the hero and again subsides. The deluge stories occur in every quarter of the earth. They form an integral portion of the archetypal myth of the history of the world, and so belong properly to part 2 of the present discussion, the cosmogonic cycle. The deluge hero is a symbol of the germinal vitality of man, surviving even the worst tides of catastrophe and sin. Part of the writing assignment for this semester covers these tracks in a slightly simplified way, of course, because you are not writing a full myth, but looking at especially the motivations of the characters and the people that we treat as heroes or mythological legends or whatever, and those people having some kind of a path through their difficulty to achieve whatever it is they are doing. Now, generally speaking, we are tailing the story from the point of view of humans who have to fight these monsters. But for our purposes, we are the monsters, and we are looking at how to achieve these levels of difficulty to make sense out of the life of somebody who is quite clearly not us. And so Campbell says that the in the end, the most important part of of the story of the myth and the story as a whole, and he kind of conflates the myth and the legend and the fairy tale and kind of the analytical categories that we have mentioned, because that is not important. What is important is the moral. Typically, the hero of the fairy tale achieves the domestic microcosmic triumph, and the hero of a myth, a world historical macrocosmic triumph. Whereas the former, the youngest or dispatched child, will becomes the master of extraordinary powers, prevails over his personal oppressors. The latter brings back from his adventure the means for the regeneration of his society as a whole. Tribal or local heroes, such as the Emperor Wang Ti, Moses, or the Aztec Tezcatlipoca, commit their boons for a single folk. Universal heroes, Muhammad, Jesus, Gautama Buddha, bring a message for the entire world. So for him, the difference between a fairy tale and a myth is their reach, essentially the story upon which the rest of the world would benefit, which in a way is probably sensible, but rather limiting in context of what we have seen before.